Hi everyone, it's Joey Remenyi from seekingbalance.com.au. Today, I'm going to be talking about the theory of positive disintegration, and our special guest is Chris Wells, who's calling in from the US, and Chris is the founder of the Dabrowski Center. So welcome, thank you for your time. Really pleased to have you.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to be here. It's a pleasure to meet you.
Yeah. So Chris and I actually have quite a bit of common ground, and the connective tissue between us really could be the theory of positive disintegration. And many of you listening are probably just hearing jargon. So why don't we start with the basics, Chris? What is it to disintegrate and why is it positive?
Whew. Well, the theory of positive disintegration was created such a long time ago, decades ago, by a man from Poland who was really fascinated personally and professionally, I would say, by suffering in a variety of different ways. He studied suicide and self-mutilation and nervousness. And so much of the work that he did, just to jump ahead into the present, is
Mm,
relevant to people who are neurodivergent and people who experience a variety of mental health crises and issues in a whole bunch of different ways. I mean, sometimes I think it's easier for me to explain like how I came to the theory as a way of explaining what it is, because
mm,
I had this long mental health history prior to discovering it. And even though by the time I did discover it when I was 40, I was pretty solid and grounded in my life and doing fairly well, I thought. But I had a history of many hospitalizations, of many diagnoses: bipolar disorder, panic disorder, ADHD,
mm,
and I'd also been identified as gifted as a kid. And so I really looked at myself through the lens of what's wrong with me. I realized that I had a nervous system that was very reactive, and that I was much more emotionally intense than other people for the most part. But I saw all of these things as flaws and problems to be solved. And so when I discovered the theory and realized that this man had reframed the things that I considered mental illness as positive developmental indicators, he saw that people who had these experiences had the potential within them,
mm,
in these experiences of crisis and disintegration or feeling like you're falling apart, where your whole experience of yourself can break down and leave you without any sense of who you are or any
mm.
direction forward. Well, I mean, it really completely changed my life to get this new understanding of what and who I was, and just really changed everything for me.
Yeah, and it's just so huge, and so many of you listening to our conversation will have gone through this pathologizing journey, doctors and so many health providers, and then spiritual people and kinesiologists, and it's always this what's wrong with me common denominator. But when I think back to my biggest, most significant disintegration, which was in my late 20s, and I really was in a dark place and I had great jobs, I was successful, quote unquote, successful to the outside eye, but huge existential yearning, just not feeling like I belonged on the planet, feeling very uncomfortable and ethically uncomfortable working in the mainstream hospital system where I was seeing all these tinnitus and vertigo clients falling through the cracks, being medicated randomly, given external prescriptions. And I could see in my heart of hearts that we needed to care for these unique neurological individuals more sensitively, more gently, in a more nuanced fashion. And so I fell apart. I had you know, a very dark time. And I cocooned, and I did have to deconstruct myself and reconstruct myself and then become the version of me that could build Rocksteady and work with people in a new way, with a new perspective on the world and a new sense of self and a new sense of who I am, who I'm not. So it was a real sense of falling apart in order to rebuild myself to be stronger and more clear seeing. So that was my first real doozy. And I just want to reiterate, if I had have pathologized myself back then, I would never have been able to be the person I am today. I would have been stuck in a medicated system feeling like I'm wrong instead of intuitively following that darkness and allowing myself to crumble.
Mm,
And thankfully I had the skills and tools to do that. But yeah, so
right.
we're really looking at a non-pathologizing perspective when life gets hard. Do you want to
Right.
speak a little bit more about your own journey or what you've seen and learnt through the Dabrowski Center? I know you did a PhD, really deep diving into this.
Sure. Actually, I discovered the theory while I was a doctoral student in psychology. And it's interesting to me in retrospect because in my studies, I didn't find anything that was really catching me and making me feel passionate during my program. I mean, to some extent I did, but I was interested in parenting stress, actually. That was the main thing that I was focusing on. And I was just kind of at the beginning of my dissertation process when I discovered the theory, and it just completely blew me away. And yet I put it aside at first because it was very uncomfortable to face the fact that I mean, I was still taking medication at the time, still considering myself, through the lens of pathology, but it just wouldn't go away. I kept searching for related information, or I was in kind of my gifted integration journey at the time too. And so, I mean, just the theory kept popping up everywhere and I couldn't get away from it. And so eventually I decided to start studying it. But for me, because I've been writing a journal, or a diary since I was a teenager, I had a ton, like a tremendous amount of personal data, and so I started looking at my writing from the past and realizing that times that had been called mania, or,
Mm.
times that I thought I had been psychotic, like all the language that I used for myself that was so negative and really like a violence against myself, I realize now. When I looked at it through the lens of the theory, I saw dynamisms. That's a word that Dabrowski came up with, that, these are the forces of development that shape us and help us become our authentic selves. But when I was in my 20s, the dynamisms were unilevel and they weren't bringing me out of my suffering. It was up to me to eventually have the moments of clarity, or like clear seeing, like you said, that helped me, and even using my imagination to say, I don't have to live like this. I could be like this person that I can imagine myself being, and moving in that direction, and just starting to like affirm the things about myself that I knew were right, and that was the way to go. But yeah, but discovering the theory was huge, and it took me a long time to figure out how to work with it and how to bring it to other people.
Yeah.
And the biggest breakthrough there was the Positive Disintegration podcast that I host with my friend and, my co-host, whom I love, Emma Nicholson. And working with Emma has been amazing. And just the feedback we get from people about how meaningful the theory is for them, and just like that they have like a sense of belongingness thanks to discovering this community and this understanding of themselves. It's really exceeded my expectations.
Yeah, it's wonderful, and I recommend the podcast to anyone listening. Just want to circle back a bit and, you know, authentic living, living with integrity, our higher selves, our values. These are actually all conversations we deeply investigate in my community and in Rocksteady, with our shared philosophy being, what is my body saying to me? If I have these screaming ears, or if I've got all of this vertigo and dizziness and my physiology is really activated and upset, why? Like, what's going on? What wisdom is coming through my physical body? And then I incorporate, not just physical, but the mental, emotional, spiritual layers of ourselves and our being. And I think this is all really what Dabrowski was on about. And it's 100 years. I think it was 1920 that he first came up with the theory. And you mentioned the uni level, and I thought that could be useful to talk about because many of my listeners will have, very debilitating, disabling tinnitus or vertigo, but in that uni level phase of really wanting an external fix, wanting to get rid of it, just not wanting to look inwards, not being reflective, just not ready yet to walk in toward that dark night of the soul. Do you want to talk a little bit about the different levels? And then I'll chime in as well and Because I think that's
Sure.
interesting and relevant, and it's okay. Like if you're not ready, that's okay. It's all part of it. We go on the journey starting where we are.
Yes, totally. Sure. Well, actually, I don't talk about the theory the way that most people do, where they talk about the five levels. I I prefer to really think of them as different types of development that have tremendous overlap between most of them, you know. And so it helps people kind of stay away from rigid thinking around them to talk about the processes within them. And so with the unilevel disintegration, that is a place where it's deeply uncomfortable for one thing, and often has a variety of somatic issues, which I have experienced myself. And one of the things that I was so fascinated with when I discovered your community and what you do is that I too went through this experience 15 years ago about of having vestibular migraines and going to vestibular physical therapy and just like you said, just looking for all external ways to solve the problem, never thinking that it was the circumstances of my life that were the issue at the time, which totally were. I
Yeah.
was working in child welfare, and that was not the field for me. And my father was dying and then did die. And I just was not connecting the stressors in my life to that experience. And work was not supportive. Like my boss was so harsh about me taking the time to go to vestibular physical therapy even, and it was such a time of suffering. And
Mm.
so it and then I remember being like, oh wow, it like miraculously resolved once I left my job and like started my PhD program. And so yeah, I mean, but that's who I was. I realize now that now at 51, I'm very much in my body, grounded, have created all of these practices for myself to live this way and to live in the moment.
Yeah.
And that's not who I was 15 years ago. And I just was going from crisis to crisis and all in my head and not
Yeah.
connected with myself at all.
Which, as a neurodivergent being, makes so much sense because our experience is so rarely mirrored back to us that there's this chasm between what's going on in our inner world, what's happening in the outer world, what's real. And so this mind body disconnect is sort of part of the path when we're living in such a conflicting mismatch. And I wanted to circle back to this idea of the person environment fit. And so when we're in careers or relationships or places that do not nurture our nervous system, there's nothing wrong with us. We're not abnormal. We're not weak. Our nervous system is saying, hey, lights are too bright, conversations too many, too loud, too crowded, not feeling listened to, not feeling loved or belonging, not feeling safe. The nervous system is giving us information. It's our job to listen. And then when we're brave enough, either tend to that ourselves and or self-advocate to the outer world to make those outer world changes, because the outer world can change rather than us have to change to fit the outer world. So the person environment fit is really what Chris was referring to back then with her vestibular migraine experience. And so I just wanted to really put that in front and center. It's important.
It is. Yeah, thank you. It's so critical. And so, yeah, like that during that time, I was really suffering, and can now look back on that and say, yes, like that was a time of unilevel disintegration, but it was also mixed with multi-level. And so I guess the ways that we can talk about these processes to make sense of them is to say that when you're in a unilevel disintegration, you're kind of you're without a channel out of it. That's one way to look at it, where you're in an experience of suffering, but you don't have a clear way of resolving it because the dynamisms in unilevel disintegration are ambivalences or self sabotaging behaviors outside of our conscious awareness, really. These are just we're experiencing the world as like things are being imposed on us. We
Yeah.
don't see our own agency.
More victim, helpless, hopeless, powerless.
It could be all of those things, and those can be times of addiction.
Mhm.
And I can say that for sure for me. I mean, I have been through multiple types of addiction in my life, and it was always so easy for me to just like go into that as a way of escaping and trying to,
Yeah.
avoid myself and my experiences of suffering. And so multi-level disintegration is different. These dynamisms are more conscious. They are inner conflicts that are clearer to the person experiencing them. They can include like guilt or shame, dissatisfaction with yourself, and also being positively maladjusted to the experiences in your environment at multiple levels. Like, I mean, I'm an American. I would say I'm positively maladjusted to many things in my society,
Mm.
in my government, and just so many things in my life. I feel like it would be a problem if I was adjusted to them. And
Yeah.
so, the multi-level experience is more rooted in one's agency and their will and their ability to see a way out of where they are, and that ability to see what should be and move toward it.
Yeah. And I'm just thinking if I try and put that into like a usable example for people listening, maybe when we're at that uni level space, and I agree with Chris, I think it's more circular that we move in and out of all of these different levels based on hormones and life and whatnot. But
Right.
let's say uni level is when we feel that life is happening to us, everything's very messy and less clear, and it can really feel like the migraines come and just control us. When we're in that uni level space where we're starting to actually have an identify, okay, I'm angry, my boundaries are being violated, I need to have a really difficult conversation with my husband. He may or may not be available to have it. And we start to have that conscious awareness that there's a conflict, there's something going on. And I think I know that there's something I can do to address that conversation. So we're more actively participating in the stimuli and in that inner world, outer world dance. Does that land for you,
It
Chris?
does. Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. And it's just like, I think when you're in the multi-level disintegration, it's it's not always clear in the early stages or phases of it, like I think, the fact that he called it spontaneous multi-level disintegration shows that it's something that starts happening to you and feels surprising. And I know for myself, when I first started having like the multi-level dynamisms, I did feel periods of astonishment where I was shocked by my own behavior, shocked what was happening around me, moments of disquietude with myself, wondering, am I losing my mind? I think that when you're going through like what you said, like dark night of the soul times are times when you're like, oh my gosh, like, where you get that sense of like, am I losing my mind? And so I think that like for me, it was always so important to have the right people to help me when I was in those experiences. I am somebody who is, I realize, very blessed to have so many supportive relationships in my life, because I think one thing that is essential to making a disintegration positive is to having the right supportive people in your life to help you, because I think so many of the dynamisms happen in relationships. Like I mean, when if you use like a partnership or a marriage as an example, I mean, if your partner isn't emotionally available to you, if you're struggling to communicate and get your needs met with your partner, it's really easy to start wondering, is there something wrong with me, or just being angry, shutting down.
Am I too
But
much?
if
Abnormalizing,
exactly.
you know?
So it's a whole different experience if you are with somebody who is supportive in these moments of crisis. And, I think like so much of the talk about the theory of positive disintegration makes it sound like it's all within us. And, we have this third factor and this drive to develop. Well, we don't develop in a vacuum. We have people in our lives who can make or break us to some extent,
Mm,
I think, and or like can can really change our path for the better or worse.
yeah. Yeah, I feel emotional actually because that's where part of our journeys are different in that I managed to shelter myself and cocoon myself in a functional, healthy way up until the age of 35, where I was aware that the outer world was kind of contaminating for me, as in We haven't even spoken about excitabilities and overexcitabilities, but in terms of my neurological nature being deep and intense and complex and blah, and knowing that my experience actually was being shut down and rejected and not supported. So having to cocoon myself, shelter. I had a yoga background from the age of 15, so I had a lot of non-judgment within myself. I had self-compassion. I had the skills and tools to befriend myself. So for me, drawing inwards to become my own mentor and my own therapist and my own friend was life-saving. And I did try reaching out over and over and over again, and it was re-traumatizing. So the universe sent me on what I now call the apprenticeship of befriending myself, and that the inward journey when there isn't an external anchor, and you can try, but that's the most vulnerable piece for me is you can't force other people to get it.
No.
And you can't force other people to show up and be there. And my personal experience was really having to surrender to that and keep coming in here and leaning on the natural world, non-humans. However, got to 35, married, enter relational space, fell pregnant, had two baby boys, beautiful. And suddenly then I was apprenticing the relational field and navigating self-advocacy and masks off and vulnerability. And so now I'm in that state I'm 40 of developing community, village, friendships, peers in a more authentic way.
Mm.
So I kind of have one foot in each realm. Um, and I think really we just do the best we can. And I think absolutely if you have external people you trust, who you feel your nervous system relaxes with, when you feel seen and heard, it's just the best. But also holding lightly that for some people, and it's quite common in my community actually, they're very isolated, they're very alone. And finding that community it's brave, it's courageous, it's a leap. And I would definitely say keep trying. But
Yes.
when you don't have it, you have this in here.
Right. Yeah, you're so lucky that you had had yoga training at such a young age.
Oh, it saved my life for sure. Yeah. I started it when I was 15, like a very, what do you call it? Special interest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Devoured the books. I thrive in sensory deprivation or minimal sensory inputs. That's my nervous system. So the quietness and the slowness of Iyengar yoga was just medicine for me. And thank goodness. I think I would have been a pathologized mess, to be quite honest. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, really, like learning to befriend yourself is one of the key things that, I mean, for sure, like for me, that was part of the switch of discovering this theory was being able to change that whole lens from always seeing myself as having something wrong with me. And that's why I chuckled when you said we haven't even talked about the excitabilities yet. I mean,
Yeah.
because yeah, most people do start with that as like the way into talking about this, but I had always seen these parts of myself as wrong and not okay, and certainly not something to befriend and learn to even appreciate about myself.
Such a journey. And for those listening, overexcitabilities, you can possibly speak to it a little bit more fluidly than I can, but there are different ways in a human's neurological system that we literally fire those electrochemical impulses between our synapses. Neurodivergent people, gifted people, um, will have more neurological activity occurring. So there's a higher physiological load in daily life. So if I just think about looking at the sunset, if you have a neuronormative or neurotypical person looking at the sunset, they're like, oh, wow, that's pretty. I take a photo and cool, what's for lunch? It's possible you have, for example, a highly gifted person whose neurology is literally having fireworks and explosions at the sunrise, and it's a deeply existential moment with multidimensional threads of stories and imagery, and the whole musculature system is going, and it can be really visceral. And then to have
Maybe
no,
some tears.
Yeah, and then to have no one to mirror that back to you, to talk about it with, to understand it, it could be frightening, it could be like a sort of a spiritual awakening experience, and then to have to sort of privately hide all of that in, that's another neurological load. So this is day in, day out of these excitabilities. And I think to cope, we shut them down, which leads to numbing, which leads to muscle tension, which leads to migraines. And, it just there's consequences of consequences because of this neurological difference.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, you see them in all the kinds of neurodivergences, I would say. I would be surprised if they weren't present in any types of neurodivergence. I think that it's a key part of these experiences, and that it's one of the things that does underlie them, where like autistic people, ADHDers, overlap between them. Overexcitability seems to be like a key part of that. And so Dabrowski differentiated them into five types: emotional, imaginational, intellectual, sensual, and psychomotor. And so, when people come to the theory, this is often the first thing they discover. Me too. And it's right away you see yourself in them. And it's
Mhm.
like, whoa, how
Yeah.
interesting. Like I thought my emotional overexcitability was a mood disorder, and like it just by the time I was in middle school, I was thinking that way and just ready to pathologize myself. Like, it's not okay to be this emotional and to be so sensitive, but that's what can create these dynamisms that Dabrowski talked about. As he saw that overexcitability not only a challenge. I mean, he called it a tragic gift. That's Emma's website. And it's so not only like challenging, but also the keys to personal growth and our development, because they can become dynamisms that help us shape ourselves.
Yeah. So, I mean, just to summarize that, the way I engage with this and sort of the way I embody it is, we've got all these beautiful humans all over the planet. And it feels to me that our responsibility is to really get to know who we are. And I think when we have a bit of a neurological push that gets our attention, we have some data to work with. So the more you've got these intensities moving through you in daily life, the more you're actually nudged and invited to sort of go, oh, what was that about? My body's teaching me something here and I'm learning something. Whereas if life is really easy breezy, cruisy every day, you just wake up and do the same thing. There's not much growth, there's not much change, there's not much inquiry, there's not much need for reflectiveness. And that's all fine, by the way. I actually have deep friends who are like that. It's just life is cruisy for them. Um, I feel like as a planet and as an ecosystem, we need some people really going through these kind of ecological pollinating growth spurts where we see the world differently and we challenge norms and we question politics and we start to really shake up ideas because that can be our ecological imprint and our role. And then, for argument's sake, my friends who have the easy breezy, cruisy neurology and they just wake up and go to work and then do it all again the next day, they're the bread and butter keeping society functional. Because if everybody's a roller coaster, I mean, that's going to be a disaster too. So we need the diversity, bring neurodiversity for our humanity. Our species needs diversity. So really welcoming the intensity as an invitation for exploration and for truth is kind of the way I experience it and the way I work with it in my clients who are going through these pulls, the pull of the body.
Yes. Yeah, I love that. That totally. We need people who have that ability to just get up and do this work every day that they do. And I just I spent so many years of my adult life wondering what was wrong with me that I couldn't do that. And I
Yeah, me
mean,
too.
it's really hard when you have a very sensitive nervous system and you see how other people see you as problematic, high maintenance, difficult to deal with. It's like, I mean, all the messages we get about being this way, I mean, they get in your head and they make it hard to love yourself. And so I think one of the beautiful things about the theory is that it does give us this framework that it's okay to be this way. This is a blessing that we can use.
Yeah. Yeah. And honestly, it's like I can just see as you're talking, when we enter the theory of positive disintegration realm, all of that energy we're putting into trying to be normal, trying to mask, trying to push through, trying to pretend, trying to fix ourselves and research the next device or pill, that's a huge amount of energy that we are
Hmm.
putting into this fix me project. When we abort that mission or just car park it and start to go, oh, okay, well, if I'm growing into the next version of myself and I'm becoming a higher version of myself and I'm learning about my values and who I am and what I stand for and how I might contribute something into community, all of that energy goes into this path of curiosity and inquiry that's so much more generative and gentle and, from my perspective, productive, because I do see people frequently who, once they learn to listen to their body and that neurological message feels heard, so the body mind is engaging in this vitality and communication, the neurology quietens down, it calms down, the body softens, the symptomatology clears up, that it's not all hard work, but some of it is definitely confronting and brave, but it's not like that all the time. So we shift our energy and we use it differently. And coming back to the creative excitabilities, instead of creatively trying to fix all of my problems and be mean to myself, that creativity might go into artwork or blogging or writing or music. So I'm using that nervous system energy and it's going out into the world, but in more nourishing ways because I understand who I am, instead of judging myself and wronging myself because I may not be mirrored by many peers, which is kind of a whole other conversation, isn't it? The mirroring.
Yeah, the mirroring. That's right. That's once you find the right mirroring, wow, how life-changing that can be. It's just mind-blowing to me. I just didn't know that this was something I was missing until I had it. It's
Yeah,
so, I mean, it just makes me sad sometimes to reflect on how little of it I had until I was in my 40s. It just, whoa, very. So this is really critical, and this is one of the beautiful things about those of us who do work to create community around these things that we have studied and worked with, professionally and personally, is that it's cool to be able to give the mirroring and to know that we're providing that. And I know that, I mean, I've
yeah,
gotten a lot of podcast feedback about that, that people feel mirrored by the things that we say, which is really humbling and amazing to hear, but it's so critical. And I think that for me, like, because of I'm so intellectual, I have felt so mirrored in Dabrowski's own words and
yeah.
reading his work and the things that he was writing about. Just whoa, like the people he talked about, like, because he studied a lot of eminent and creative individuals and then wrote about them in light of the theory. And like, I just remember all the times I read about Kafka and thinking, ah, like he's talking about his world of dreams as if it's this great thing, whereas I thought my world of dreams was,
Crazy.
mental illness.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. And so it's just like
Oh,
it's such a
yeah.
special experience.
Yeah. Yeah. I could cry. It's huge. And it's really difficult to convey to someone who experiences peer-to-peer mirroring. Because ideally, you wake up and you get peer-to-peer mirroring really from a young age, straight up, maybe even in your own family, your own community, certainly at school. That would be normal. You meet people that have a very similar neurological makeup to you. So you have a lot of me too moments, and your body language is in sync, and your conversation's got a rhythm. I didn't get that either until I was 40. And I had no idea I was missing it because it's an invisible concept. And then once
Right.
I started meeting my people, it was really confronting. And yeah, just like everything changes. It's almost like taking glasses off and just being like, oh, I exist. I'm real. What? So it's very hard to explain, but I can tell you from my perspective in terms of how I experience neurology and neuroscience, it literally was like my entire world reorganized really quickly about how I view myself, how I view the world, how I fit in, how I position myself. It was just like a rapid truth that just
Mm.
set into my body. I'd almost describe it as the reverse of a trauma. Like, when you have a very traumatic experience, you get this rapid neurological imprinting. It felt like the reverse of that, where suddenly it was like, oh, well, this makes more sense. And my whole body went, zoop. So
Yeah.
it's so essential. And I just want to say, for those of you who are neurodivergent or parenting neurodivergent children, that's pretty much the gold standard recommendation, is try and find like-minded peers for your neurodivergent kids. Like, get them into a social group where they can be more free. And there's that neural cultural mirroring. And I think there's a lot of awareness around it these days, which is great.
Yeah. It's true. I mean, it's so special, and like you said, it's like an invisible thing. It's hard to explain, but you know it when you have it, and you
Oh,
finally do have that experience totally. And you also made me remember that I think one of the most important early bits of advice I got when I first started, when I first had come to theory and like the gifted community here in America, is to stop trying to be normal, because
yeah.
that was such a misguided goal, and just not. And I just thought to myself, well, this is what but I've spent like more than 20 years wanting to be normal. And so for me, like a big part of my process, I think, was just
Unlearning.
stopping, exactly, like unlearning my own messages to myself and changing my self-talk and not being so brutal with myself. Like, I realized at some point just how hard I was on myself and how awful my inner critic was, and just the way I talked to myself was so violent. And now I just never catch myself doing that anymore, where I just am automatically thinking like, what's wrong with you? Like, it's just, when I think about how harsh I was with myself for so many years, like, I just wish I'd known when I was younger not to be that way.
Yeah. It's definitely a journey, and I completely relate. And even so I only discovered the word neurodivergence like 6 months ago. So I mean, I've been in actually the world of it, but without the language. Um, and so
Wow.
there's been a lot of sense making going on for me and for my community members of this, differences in neurology and the whole conversation of diversity. And it's beautiful. And I think what I've come to learn, because you can say, oh, we're all different, and, I'll get to know your brain and body, but there's something very powerful about actually going, I relate to autistic people, or, yeah, I have OCD tendencies and I'm unapologetic about it. And this is how it's therapeutic for me. And this is how I'm showing up. Like, so there's something very nourishing. I'm not a fan of labels, by the way, but there's something very nourishing about having a sense of identity, like self-determined identity. It's incredibly neuroprotective, because if I know I have this excitable, reactive nervous system, that I'm very intuitive and sensitive, there's gifts to that. And going to a supermarket could kill me. So, like, I have to be really moderating the sensory loading of my day. And that doesn't make me bad, right? I have neuroprotective self-concept that I can prepare myself, sleep well, nourish myself, do all the things I know I need to do before entering a crowded, bright light situation. So there's that level of self-care, self-identity, self-concept that keeps me always in my center, in my power, and out of that inner critic space, which is so easy to fall into, because who can't go to a supermarket, right? It's just a supermarket. Like, what's wrong with you? Come on already. It's easy to fall down that path. So yeah, I feel like this conversation with Dabrowski, with the wider neurodiversity lens, I feel like it's very, very, very powerful. And I urge everyone listening to get curious, listen to the podcast and follow neurodivergent people and just see where you feel resonance. Like, literally in your body, you'll feel it. You'll be like,
Right.
oh, that makes sense, right? And it's very relaxing to soften into that truth, to no longer have to try. So
Yes.
yeah, I relate a lot to what you've shared, Chris. How would
Same. Although I love our differences too. I love hearing
yeah.
people's stories. And one of my favorite things about the podcast has been having people on to talk about their experiences and like through this lens because it's just fascinating to me. And I mean, I love working with the theory with clients too, but yeah, like it's fun to have a conversation like this and just get so much out like so quickly.
Mm, yeah. I mean, I've really devoted my life to it. The truth is, I didn't know anything about Dabrowski, but we're kin.
Mm,
And
yes.
I guess it's through my yoga background and reading so much of that ancient wisdom, about the way we participate in our own experience. So that's really what yoga taught me, that I am not a victim to life. I'm participating in my bodily experience and I'm shaping myself. So I had that from a young age, just that concept and idea. And yoga also talks about the different layers of being. So we're not just blood and bone, that there's the breath layer and there's the emotional layer and there's the wisdom layer. So all this subtle data
Right.
that I had curiosity toward from a very young age. And so by the time I got to that, really, really dark, disintegrative time in my late 20s, which did take me to a suicidal break point, which really gave me that. This is the dynamism, people. You get to very, very big feelings and you choose. It's a choice point. And that was when I chose to leave the university, to leave the hospital system, to relocate myself, to work online, to leave the 9 to 5 world, which was killing my body and my brain. And I had to craft a life that worked for my neurotype. And so I went to a critical breaking point, and then I had to remap a new way of being in the world. And now I've completely lost what I was talking about before that.
It's okay. Well, but no, but that is I'm glad you brought this up because that choice point,
Yeah,
is the third factor. That's what Jabrowski talked about was that, you know, this, that is this active choice, this conscious decision making that's also action. It's not just thinking about, but acting and
yeah,
living your values. And that, is so much easier said than done. Like living our values and, like you said, like having that sovereignty, being who you really are and I love what you said about like crafting your life because that is what you have to do if you're neurodivergent. Like we don't live right now in worlds that support us well, and so it's up to us to figure out how to do it. It's not easy, but
yeah,
every day I mean in every moment we have the ability to make a choice, and it's all we can choose whether or not we feel harmed by things too. I mean, I feel like I've had to really work harder at that, at like letting go of, I used to be so angry. I think that that was like, I just took everything personally. And part of my process of growth since discovering the theory has been to do what you did since you were young and read a lot of, spiritual teachings and just read from other perspectives and to see how much Dabrowski truly took like spiritual development and made it a psychological theory. It's really fascinating, but he
yeah,
really did. He took that spiritual path and helped us understand it through psychological terms, which I think is really cool.
yeah. And that's what I was getting to is I think because of that education as a younger woman or younger person, by the time I really got to that dark breaking point, and I remember like I was scared to tell doctors what I was experiencing because I kind of knew I didn't want to hear their perspective. Like I knew I would be judged basically. And so I was very careful about who I spoke to. And I tried various spiritual kinesiology, physiotherapy, whatever. I tried reaching outwards and I tried the external experts, and I certainly didn't ignore the medical world. I was working in the medical world, but I somehow had an intuitive understanding of the limitations of the outer world and the role and responsibility of me in my inner world. And it really did take me to breaking point to have the self-authority and the courage to step into that, which was massive. And I did do it alone. I really, which has actually some strengths because there's less distraction when you're really in your own lane. You're not juggling other people's ideas and opinions. But yeah, that was very pivotal, and it was what So when people come to me and I see them struggling with 10, 20 years of chronic tinnitus, vertigo, and the relationship's falling apart, they can't work anymore, like being housebound, like really serious, debilitating, invisible conditions. And so I left the city, developed my new methodologies and ways of meeting these people in a more physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, holistic container, and taking people through this process of crafting their life to suit their neurological needs. And so that whole apprenticeship I went through became the offering of what I could then pollinate back out into the world. And all of this is sort of really just making sense to me now when I look back, with the power of hindsight, that it was that Dabrowski style process that I quite frankly felt I had no choice. It was die or change. So,
Right.
so it was a dynamism for sure.
Right. Yeah. I can totally relate. I have had that moment so many times of die or change. It seems like it feels that way anyway. I mean, for me, I feel like it's like I came in to discovering the theory after having so much baggage of addiction and mental illness and treatment and looking for externals for so long. That is like a big difference in our stories. So yeah, it's really interesting to me, but I love that you were able to do it on your own and figure it out. Like that is very Dabrowski, and he really believed in auto psychotherapy. He believed that therapists could help clients develop their own auto psychotherapy so that they weren't having to stay with a therapist for years at a
That's what I
time.
do. But that's also because um, part of my trauma is the relational trauma. So I would get re-triggered and re-traumatized by therapists.
Mm,
So that was, you can't plan that stuff. So it's like the universe just you know, kept me on the path of trusting myself and trusting my body. And so I work very much in the body. So I've just written a new book, which won't be out for another year or so, but Invisible Medicine is the journey of how do we redirect our gaze inwards and trust the inner realms and the sensory landscapes of the body, and to really learn to heed the intelligence of the body. And that journey has essentially shaped my life and changed my life, because my body is the only safe haven I've had. And I don't get my answers up here between my ears, that'll just get me into trouble. So I really have to drop into the felt sense of the body and intuit, okay, where am I? What am I needing? Be in direct experience here and now, not 5 years from now, like to have all of that ancient wisdom very much accessible and alive. And that is how I maintain my sanity. That's how I organize all of the data I'm taking in. I have high data intake. And yeah, it's how I empty myself so I'm not cluttered with everybody else's stories and everybody else's emotions and all of the wars and political conflict. Like, I'm porous. I can hold it all in my body and just be riddled with stresses and I can be an emotional, depleted, exhausted mess.
hmm
So having this understanding of input, digestion, excretion, and output is how I maintain my sanity, basically. So yeah, that this whole journey has been the gift that keeps on giving for me.
Yeah. I can see that, which is amazing. And yes, like what you were just saying reminded me that I think another big thing for me to figure out in my 40s was how empathic I am, how much I am able to sense other people's energy, to absorb it, to take it in and I never realized that that was happening. And so figuring that out, understanding that yes, I am taking on other people's emotions without realizing it, or I was, and now being able to tell the difference between other people's emotions and mine, to be able to have boundaries against that and not take it in, huge. Not anything I was ever aware of until middle age, which is kind of my ignorance about myself is shocking when I reflect back on it.
Yeah, yes and no, because I mean, at the end of the day, we are all literally doing the best we can with the resources we have, and that includes the books we have access to. And the role models and peers in our environment and the stories we're swimming in. Like, to me, stories are the greatest medicine. And that's
Hmm.
what Dabrowski gives us. He gives us a new story. Oh, you're not broken. Oh, you're not sick. Oh, you're not wrong. You're just going through a really intense time, and you're going to need support to nurture yourself through that. Like, hang in there. You are rebuilding yourself. Find what matters to you and follow that thread. It's an entirely new story. And essentially, that's similar to the Rocksteady story, which is your body is talking to you. The sensations that you have are designed by your body for you to feel them. You do not need to be afraid of them, but we do need to heed the wisdom. What's the message?
Yes.
If this is your soul sending you a text message, let's read it. So going through that journey with a new story, it changes everything. So
Definitely.
yeah, culture, politics, environment, we're swimming in collective grief. If we're porous, sensitive, empathic, neurodivergent beings, how are we practicing our hygiene? And so
That's right.
that's been a huge exploration for me. And talking about boundaries and internal clutter have become really potent portals for my community too, because I think symptoms are louder when we're carrying more and when we're cluttered and when we're rushing and we just don't have space to actually kind of breathe. So yeah, talking about the invisible and the unseen has really feels like one of the most central conversations of my life. Yeah.
Wow, this is really neat. Thank you. I'm so glad to be here and have this conversation with you. When I started listening to some of your episodes and stuff and looking at your website and like the videos you have of case studies, and I thought, I mean, this is amazing. I remember, just like I said, I remember 15 years ago having these issues, not finding anyone
Mm.
who had anything helpful for me. That the vestibular physical therapist just, it was like these exercises, but no one was helping me tap into what I really needed to learn, which was to trust myself, to listen to myself, and to do all the things that you have just talked about. And so I'm so glad that you're doing this work and that you see the connections with the work that I do in this theory, because I am constantly trying to figure out the other points of connection with the theory. It's lived in this one little field in North America for the most part, like just not growing, not being studied elsewhere, not having like the somatic connections. And so, you know,
It's
just
definitely thematic.
hearing
Oh yeah.
yes, like just hearing your take on this and your points of connection with it, I love it. And I'm so happy that we're having this conversation.
Yeah, no, me too. And yeah, I still grieve, and I feel the deep tragedy in the pathologizing way of the world, and actually not just towards humans, but also towards non-humans and our ecology. And
Yes.
I feel like the conversation sort of doesn't stop here. It's how are we in relationship to ourselves? How are we in relationship to each other? How are we caretaking and caregiving for the environments that we're living in? Sick people are sick probably because of sick environments, really. And I think this is starting to get us into the nuance and the nitty-gritty of, okay, if my body is screaming at me and I'm starting to feel a little bit schizophrenic and manic, what's going on in my world? Like, how can I slow down? How can I declutter? How can I digest? How can I do the work that I'm responsible for so I can show up and shape the environment to better not only nurture me, but nurture everyone? And I think that's a really important story if we want to feed more stories out, pollinate more stories into the world, that there's nothing wrong with neurodivergent people. We may be statistically rare or less common, but what if we are the canaries in the coal mine? What if we are the ones picking up on the fractures and traumas and power imbalances in the environment? And our physiology is just getting sick. And we're fight, flight, freeze, fawning. Our physiology is reactive because it's our job, ecologically speaking, to speak up, to advocate, to create those changes in the wider environment for everyone's benefit. And so the tragedy for me is just all of the stifled voices, all of the men and women and non-gendered, non-binaries who are not being listened to and not being believed. When, I think biodiversity, neurodiversity, we really need to all learn how to honor and listen to each other. Neurotypical, neuronormative, neurodivergent, all of us need to stop and listen. And if we don't have like the theory of positive disintegration type support or the Rocksteady type support, it's almost impossible to advocate or speak up or even make sense of what you're feeling, which again just means that canary in the coal mine is lost. It's silenced. The bird just dies and no one notices. So I really feel like there is a much wider story here where it all feeds in.
I agree. Totally.
Yeah. Can we talk a little bit about the Dabrowski Congress coming up pretty soon,
I'd
right?
love to. Yeah,
Two,
very
3 weeks,
soon.
3 weeks?
Less than 3 weeks, just like 2.5 weeks, maybe.
Okay.
Gosh, yeah. So it's July 11th through the 13th. And it's a conference that it's biennial, so every 2 years. And we are going to have both virtual and in person. So we'll have a small amount of people in person here in Denver, Colorado, USA, but we have a virtual component. So most of the participants will be virtual.
That'll be
And
me.
yeah, right. And so we have one of our keynoters is from Australia, Emma, my co-host, Emma Nicholson is in Sydney. So yeah, Emma is going to actually be hosting sessions while we're in the middle of the night here. We've really tried to break away from being so North American centric and
Yeah.
to really honor the fact that we have an international following for the theory. And so we have people presenting from all over the world, and it's going to be amazing, I think, and on a variety of topics. And some presentations will be a little more artistic and some will be more research based, and I think it's going to be a beautiful blend.
Yeah. So if you are listening to this, I really recommend that you look at the link that I will put in, get yourself a ticket. And I think these are conversations and stories that it is essential that we immerse ourselves in, because I think we need to take these steps to shift out of the pathologizing mindset and look into creatively, how am I expressing myself? How am I exploring myself? How am I getting the support, the grounding, the nurturing I need when I go through my dark souls of the night? Because if we're born neurologically intense, we'll probably have more of them, right? So I need to know me so I can fall apart really well, which, by the way, I think I do quite well now. But I have to know it's going to keep coming, right? It's a circular, disintegrative way of life. And
Right.
we need to talk about it. We need to normalize it. And I have looked at the Dabrowski Congress, what do you call it? The show notes, the
Oh,
program.
right, like the
And
program, yeah.
it looks great. There's going to be poetry. There's going to be really creative ways of exploring the intensity and the darkness. There'll be some zooming out and conceptually looking at it from a wider angle. And I just think it's all really, really nourishing. And how beautiful to get speakers, I think, from Africa and Holland, and to get that global, diverse lens. And I think there's also some things for parents of neurodivergent or gifted
Yes,
children too, isn't there? So if you have
that's
school
right.
children, there's many, many layers to this conversation. And I think it's they're conversations that the world need to have. It's my plug.
Oh, well, thank you so much. I think so too. And yes, parents, professionals, and just adults and young people too. I think we have something for everybody at this Congress, and thank you so much for having me for this conversation and for helping us get the word out because yeah, I mean, we really want people from all over the world to have an opportunity to be exposed to this information
Yeah. Yeah.
and this mirroring because that is what you'll receive in the words of our speakers.
Yeah. So maybe we should end there, that if you feel sometimes that you're crazy, if you sometimes feel that you're manic, schizophrenic, depressed, anxious, a mess, overwhelmed, overloaded,
Falling apart.
tense, just making no sense, you're just like a head on legs, if you're feeling vacuous, maybe you're feeling shattered, empty, hollow, ghost-like, dissociated, irrelevant, you're feeling alien, you're going to find your people. Like these are people who know that space, but
Yes.
they've also come back and integrated it, and their well-being is well intact. So the dark stuff, they're healthy parts of our wholeness for us to touch into as human beings. And it's important that we go there, that we feel it, that we touch the aloneness, that we touch into the depths of our darkness, because I believe they're the sacred portals that really teach us who we are. And I think coming to something like the Dabrowski Congress will give you that fuller story of the lens, or it's not just pathologized and struggle town. It's actually creatively, imaginatively explored and spoken about from that place of wholeness. So absolutely, I'll put the link in, and the website, if people want to hear that on the podcast recording, can you let us know what the website is?
Sure. Well, so for the podcast, it's www.positivedisintegration.org, or for the Dabrowski Center, it's dabrowskicenter.org.
Great.
And regardless of you spell center North American or Australian, it'll take you the same place because we
Perfect.
definitely learned that redirect lesson.
Yeah, perfect. And I'll pop a link in the show notes too for those who want to jump on board and grab tickets to the Congress. I know I'll be there, and I'm really looking forward to it. And I'm really grateful for, I can tell you've put a tremendous, tremendous amount of your life energy into the theory of positive disintegration. And I thank you for that, Chris. I think that's really beautiful, and that's your pollination back into the ecosystem. So thank you.
Thank you. I love that imagery of the pollination. Love that. I have to remember that. But yes, thank you. I appreciate that because it's been such a blessing for me and just the best.
Yeah,
It's been the most satisfying and rewarding thing I've ever done in my life. So, thank you.
beautiful. For those listening, if you want to get in touch with me, visit seekingbalance.com.au, and I'll pop links in the show notes. So thank you, Chris, and it's a bye for now.
Thank you